Video game graphics have been evolving pretty much since their inception. It is insane how far we have come, not only in terms of graphics but also the technology, as we went from the very first computers which could just do basic calculations to systems with powerful GPUs that can render 3D environments in video games in insane detail. Of course, having such power would also mean that the game devs would focus on making their games much bigger, realistic and beautiful using pre-existing technologies. However, this does have its downsides, which I would discuss in this video, where I'll be talking about what exactly has happened to video game graphics as of late, as you'd notice that a lot of video games recently are starting to look very similar to each other, and there hasn't really been many advancements in terms of graphics in the past few years. And I'll be talking about why that is. But before I do, please make sure you guys like and subscribe, as I've noticed that a lot of people who have been watching me recently aren't subscribed to me. So please guys, help a guy out and please subscribe. But without further ado, let's jump into this video. Before we get into what exactly led the graphics to become the way they are now, let's talk about the earlier days of video game graphics and how it evolved. I mean, they weren't really graphics per se, as the early computers were only limited to text-based displays. In fact, a lot of the earlier games were text-based adventures that use ASCII characters in order to create the most basic graphics for dungeons and other environments. There weren't many colors available around that time, because of technical limitations of course. You could only really use limited colors such as black or white. From here, graphics and technology evolved further as we got the graphics that were more blocky and computers such as IBM which could display up to 16 colors. There was also an increase in the resolution that computers could display, thus making game environments slightly more vibrant than the depressing black and white text screen. And up until the 90s, the amount of colors and the resolution that computers can display at a time only got better. So we went from text-based adventure dungeon crawlers such as Zork to colorful 2D environments in games such as Space Quest. You could see that these games were really experimenting with simulating different gradients and textures in video game environments. Now it's pretty crazy that we just went from black and white text screens in the early 70s to this in just a span of 10 years. But of course, what comes after that is even more impressive. Then graphics kept evolving until we reached the 16-bit era, which saw the introduction of Super Video Graphics Array in the early 90s, which could allow resolutions up to 800 to 600 and 16-bit or 24-bit colors. And of course, with this much of an advancement, games also underwent a massive transformation, with games like Doom and Wolfenstein introducing pseudo 3D graphics, which really pushed the systems to the limit. There were also games like Myst that pushed the technology further by using pre-rendered graphics in order to create pretty realistic graphics for the time. And it's pretty crazy that a game like this came out in the 90s. This definitely feels like a game far ahead of its time. What can be seen in this era specifically is that developers were really experimenting and doing new things with computer graphics that weren't possible before, resulting in games looking quite different from one another. It was a time for experimentation and creativity, as devs had hardware limits to work with. So they had to come up with cool tricks to develop their games, which is part of the reason why the games that came out around that time I remembered so fondly, because of a certain charm they have, which is still unmatched to this day. At the turn of the early 2000s, we finally started to have games with fully realized 3D environments, with games like Super Mario 64 really blowing people's minds away with how detailed the textures and even the lighting effects looked compared to its low-res 2D predecessors. This was a big step up, and it's crazy that it only took 20 to 30 years to get there. With more powerful consoles like the PS2 and the original Xbox, it became more possible for devs to be more ambitious with their games, which led to us getting realistic 3D models and character designs, which is quite a huge step up from the low-res polygons. I can only imagine what people felt when they first saw all these games in their full glory at launch. This was probably the biggest evolution seen in gaming thus far, as there was a huge distinction between the games in the 80s, 90s and the early 2000s, and developers were still experimenting with the different tools they had, and games managed to look quite graphically different from one another, even in this era. After this era, the last big evolution we got was during the transition between the PS3 and Xbox 360 and the PS4 and the Xbox One era. After the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, there was a push for games to look more realistic, and games like GTA 5 and The Last of Us are some of the games that really marked the start for games to start incorporating realism into their graphics. It also brought about the trend of making larger and more detailed open world environments to explore. There was also a major focus on 4K in gaming, with the release of PS4 Pro and Xbox One X consoles which upscaled the textures of the games to 4K. We also had stuff like dynamic lighting, much more smart enemy NPC AI, complex weather systems, a day-night cycle, and extremely realistic and detailed character models, and towards the end of that generation, real-time ray tracing was introduced. And of course, we also had infamous shrinking horse balls, which blew my mind way more than the other things to be honest. Now these changes were still seen as significant changes from the previous generation, and the games around that generation still left gamers impressed on how much technology can do and how much further it has come. But of course, having such detailed graphics came with its own setbacks, such as games taking much longer and also being much more expensive to make. And the demand for highly detailed and realistic looking games only made the wait between them much longer, which are the problems we face in the current generation of video games. The jump from the previous generation and the current generation in terms of graphics is hardly noticeable, and that is because realistic video game graphics peaked around the last generation, and we've only been seeing minor improvements which aren't really that visible to the naked eye in the last few years. Which is why a lot of big AAA games nowadays are starting to look pretty similar to each other, as devs have fewer tools available to make major improvements in graphics. Also, with the introduction of Unreal Engine 5 and more devs moving towards it since it saves them time and money from creating a new engine, this has again caused a sense of stagnation in graphics and games looking too similar to each other. There are other problems with Unreal Engine 5 as well, such as poor optimization for the current gen hardware because of its cutting edge visuals, and because of its complexity and limitations of current hardware, it's becoming harder for devs to harness that engine's full potential. Which is crazy, since back then we had devs who could do a lot more under severe technological limitations. We've also had more AAA games coming out as buggy and unpolished on release nowadays, and I do think heavily realistic and detailed graphics are partly to blame for it. I know it's also primarily because of investors rushing game devs to release games quicker, but if there wasn't such a big push for realistic, massive and overly detailed games, we'd probably have more polished games and they would probably take much less time and money to make. But AAA games nowadays are too big for their own good, and even if devs want to scale down, then quite a few gamers would be mad at them for giving them a smaller game for over $70. Now, I don't mean to be that guy, but honestly guys, bigger isn't always better, and I can say that from experience. Because more likely than not, devs are likely to be more overworked, and because of games being so massive, the hardware required to play them smoothly also grows, which births more unpolished games. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule, but those games are too far and few in between. And even then, all the hard work, sacrifice and money put into the project isn't really worth it when you can barely see a noticeable difference between current gen and last gen games. So for game devs, they're just diminishing returns. So why not just scale it down? Instead of focusing their efforts on creating 20 different areas to explore, why not just do 10? Instead of having a 60-hour game, why can't they scale it down to 20 to 30 hours? I know this is easier said than done, but it would fix quite a few problems that AAA gaming companies face nowadays, and games wouldn't take as long to make as well. So we can finally get more games now, as we've barely seen many, and it's already been 5 years since the release of the new consoles. Yet I know that AAA games won't go for this. Throughout the last couple years, alongside AAA games, we've also had a lot of indie games that have a certain charm to them. They aren't graphically the most realistic looking games ever, yet they have a really cool and unique looking art style to them. Some even recreate the same pixel-like graphics of games from the 80s and 90s and managed to give us the same charm that those games did. And they are not just indie games doing this, as quite a few mainstream games have attempted doing this as well. Games like Mirror's Edge, which has such a cool looking minimalist aesthetic to it as you're parkouring through each level. The games that are made by Atlas such as Persona and the recently released Metaphor, who have such vibrant color palettes, such unique looking UI design and flashy visuals. Hell, even Ghost of Tsushima, a massive AAA title from Sony, does this. Such games aren't particularly realistic looking in terms of graphics, yet they manage to stand out because of their remarkable art direction. And trust me, they will be remembered for years to come, just like the games from the 90s that are still remembered. Now I know most AAA games won't really go for such a visual style, as their design philosophy is completely different and is geared towards making much bigger games. Which is why it really is the best time to give smaller indie games like these a shot, as there are quite a huge number of them to try out. And you wouldn't regret it one bit. Now I'm not saying that realistic looking games are inherently bad and we should just focus on games being smaller and be more cartoony looking, but one can't deny that in today's day and age, highly detailed and realistic games are more trouble than what they are worth. It's sad to say that we most likely would never see another major jump in graphics like what was seen in the early 2000s, as realism in video games has pretty much peaked at this point, and even if we go further, games would no longer look like games anymore. It would feel like playing a movie, which is pretty weird and something that I'm not particularly on board with. But at least, let's just appreciate what we had and what we are getting from these smaller indie studios and other mainstream games that are more experimental with their visual design. In an age of monotony and lookalikes, these games truly stand out and will continue to stand out. Big budget AAA games will come and go, but these games will stay in players' hearts if they're willing to give them a shot. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. Tell me your thoughts on this matter. Do you think graphics in video games have become very stale and bland? Let me know in the comments below. But other than that, I would like to thank you guys for all the support, and I'll be back with another video pretty soon. So hope you guys have a great day. See ya!